You ever have one of those days where you just know someone's trying to push your buttons? The kind where the universe wakes up in a particularly petty mood and chooses you as its favorite chew toy? That was me, standing in front of my mailbox, jaw clenched, staring at the dented metal door hanging half open like a busted jaw. The fourth time in 3 months. The screws were stripped, the pole was scratched, and the hinges looked like they'd been through a war zone. I didn't even need to look around to know who was behind it. My neighborhood used to be quiet. Not perfect, but manageable. People waved when they mowed their lawns. Kids rode bikes without getting side-eyed. The kind of place where you knew everyone's dog by name, even if you didn't know the owners. That all changed the moment Glenn moved in. Glenn with his spotless SUV, his obsessively symmetrical flower beds, and that damned clipboard he carried like it was a badge of honor. See, Glenn didn't just move into the neighborhood, he took it over. Within weeks of buying the biggest house on the block, he ran for HOA president. No one else even bothered to run. We all thought, fine. Let him organize the 4th of July barbecue and make spreadsheets about street lamp wattage. Who cares? That was before Glenn declared his personal war against non-compliant elements. Turns out, he meant everything that wasn't exactly how he wanted it. First, it was the lawn lengths. Then the color of recycling bins. Then the unapproved patio furniture on someone's porch. But I got the special treatment. Why? Because my mailbox, my poor, average-looking, metal postbox, didn't match Glenn's vision for the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. It started with a letter taped to my door. Dear resident, your mailbox exceeds the HOA's height limit by approximately 2 inches. Please correct this discrepancy within 7 days to avoid penalty. Okay, whatever. I adjusted the post. A week later. New letter. The horizontal alignment of your mailbox is not in harmony with adjacent units. I moved it a few inches over. Next, mailbox color does not conform to the agreed-upon palette. What palette? Nobody agreed to anything. Still, I painted it gray, hoping that would be the end of it. But the real kicker came when I returned from a weekend trip and found it smashed. No note, no explanation, just lying there like roadkill on the side of the street. I replaced it again, documented everything with photos and receipts, and even filed a police report. When I asked the neighbors, no one saw anything, though I did catch Glenn walking his dog suspiciously close to it the night before. That's when I started to realize this wasn't about aesthetics. This was personal. I had dared to resist the HOA's new overlord. And Glenn? He didn't like resistance. I tried to reason with him once. Stopped him outside his house, tried to explain that I was following the rules, that I'd made every change he asked for. He didn't even look me in the eye. Just smirked and said, maybe some people just aren't meant to live in a place with standards. That night, I stewed. I wasn't a confrontational guy by nature. I paid my dues, mowed my lawn, didn't throw wild parties. I minded my own business. But something about the way Glenn looked at me, like I was trash he couldn't wait to have hauled away, made my blood boil. The next morning, I got up, made my coffee, and walked out to get the paper. That's when I saw them. 2 massive decorative boulders sitting directly in front of my mailbox. And I mean massive. Taller than my hip, wide as a car tire, and heavy enough that no human without a forklift was moving them alone. They were carefully placed, one on each side, but just close enough to make it physically impossible for the mail truck to pull up or for anyone to open the mailbox without climbing over. I froze. My coffee trembled in my hand. Was this even legal? It couldn't be. It had to be some kind of code violation. But even if it was, who was I going to complain to? The HOA was Glenn. His little board was just his group of lawn-obsessed buddies who nodded at everything he said. I might as well scream into a pillow. But I had to try something. So I did what I thought made the most sense. I called the post office. A nice enough woman answered. I explained what happened, asked if they could send someone out, or at least confirm it was an issue. She sighed, clearly hearing the frustration in my voice, and said that while they appreciated the information, there wasn't much they could do unless the obstruction was officially reported through a postal field review. In the meantime, my mail would be marked as undeliverable due to obstruction. Translation: I was cut off. Later that day, I saw Glenn standing in his driveway, sipping something from a travel mug and watching the boulders like they were pieces of fine art. I walked up to him, asked directly, "Did you do this?" He shrugged. Decorative landscaping is allowed within property lines. Maybe you should forward your mail to someone who follows the rules. Then he smiled. That same smug little grin he always wore when he was right and knew you couldn't do anything about it. That was it. That was the moment something in me snapped. Not with rage, no, something deeper. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just nodded, turned around, and went back into my house. Because if Glenn wanted to play games with my mailbox, he had no idea who he was dealing with. He thought I was just some quiet guy with a few tools and a stubborn streak. He didn't know I had a background in logistics, a father who worked 30 years for the USPS, and a whole lot of free time. And most importantly, he didn't know what was coming next. The next few days were quiet on the surface. I went about my routine like nothing had happened. Mowed the lawn. Took out the trash. Even waved to Glenn when I saw him smugly walking his golden retriever past my now-defunct mailbox, boulders still firmly planted like monuments to his pettiness. But inside, I was plotting. That night, I sat down with my laptop and typed in one phrase, how to become a postmaster. At first, it was just curiosity, maybe even a bit of a joke. But then I clicked a few links, read a few government pages, and a little idea started to snowball in my head. It turns out that in smaller towns and semi-rural communities, local post offices sometimes accept applications for temporary or even permanent postmasters when someone retires or transfers. You didn't need to be some high-ranking government worker. You didn't even need a specific degree. What they wanted were people with management experience, community knowledge, and clean records. And as fate would have it, our town's current postmaster was just a few weeks from retiring. I remembered seeing a tiny notice pinned to the community board by the deli that said something about upcoming vacancy, inquiries welcome. At the time, I'd barely paid attention. But now? It felt like destiny. I started digging deeper. The application process wasn't short, but it wasn't impossible either. A formal resume, references, background check, a couple of interviews, and an exam on USPS protocols. Thanks to my late father, I already had a solid understanding of how the postal system worked. As a kid, I used to ride with him on weekends, listening to him explain how routing worked, what codes meant, and why timing was everything. I didn't realize how much I remembered until I started reading the manual and found myself nodding along like it was an old language I hadn't spoken in years. I updated my resume, emphasizing the time I ran logistics for a warehouse during my early career. Highlighted my local ties, my conflict resolution experience, and even threw in some community volunteer work. I had nothing to hide, and honestly, I had nothing to lose. The following week, I drove out to the regional post office an hour away. I handed in my forms, went through a preliminary interview, and scheduled the postal assessment exam. It was grueling, not because it was hard, but because I had to pretend that I wasn't dying to tell Glenn about it. Every time I saw him, I had to keep a straight face while he strutted around like he'd won. It wasn't easy. But I kept my mouth shut. The second interview went even better. I met with the outgoing postmaster, Janet, a woman in her 60s who'd been running the show for 20 years and was more than ready to retire to Florida. She asked me why I wanted the job. I paused, then told her the truth, because I care about this community. And I believe access to the mail is more than a service. It's a right. And some people have forgotten that. She looked at me, held my gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, then nodded. Good answer, she said. 2 weeks later, I got the call. I was standing in my kitchen when the regional office told me, "We're pleased to inform you that you've been selected as interim postmaster for Willow Creek, effective immediately." I had to sit down. Me. The guy Glenn thought he could bully into silence. I was now the one in charge of every piece of mail that entered or exited this neighborhood. The following Monday, I put on my new uniform polo, clipped on the ID badge, and walked into the small brick post office that sat just off Main Street. Janet was waiting, smiling, handing over her keys and her decades of carefully labeled files. I shook her hand, thanked her for her service, and sat down behind her old wooden desk. It felt surreal. Like I'd been handed the controls to a train that had once run over me. One of my first duties was organizing a routine inspection of postal routes in the area. I made sure to include Glen Street on the list, with very specific notes about obstructions to delivery. I knew the regulation chapter and verse by now, 18 U.S. Code Section 1705, destruction of letterboxes or mail. It was no joke. Blocking or tampering with mail wasn't just a nuisance, it was a federal offense. Punishable by fine or even imprisonment in some cases. I drafted an internal report, cited the law, took photos of the boulders, and submitted everything to the regional office for record. But I didn't wait for them to act. As acting postmaster, I had the authority to request removal of any obstruction that prevented lawful delivery of mail. I contacted the appropriate enforcement liaison, made the call, and scheduled the removal. On Thursday morning, a government-issued flatbed truck rolled into the neighborhood, followed by 2 postal inspectors in uniform. They parked right in front of Glen's perfect lawn, where the boulders still sat like thrones of passive aggression. One of the inspectors walked up, checked the placement, took measurements, and nodded to the truck driver. Within 20 minutes, the boulders were lifted off the ground with a small crane, strapped down, and hauled away. The inspectors left a formal notice taped to Glen's front door, explaining the violation and citing the specific code. I didn't need to be there. I didn't even need to say a word. The law spoke for itself. But oh, how I wanted to see his face. That afternoon, I got an email from Glen addressed to the local postmaster. It was a very long and very angry letter accusing the Postal Service of harassment and property theft. I read it twice, smiled, and then did what any good postmaster would do. I printed it out, stamped it, and filed it under "Resolved." No reply necessary. By the end of the week, I had restored mail access to every resident on the street. No more obstructions. No more delays. The carriers thanked me. One of them, a woman named Tina, said, "You wouldn't believe how long we've had problems on this street. No one ever did anything." "Well," I said, handing her a fresh route map, "they do now. Glen tried to block my mailbox. Now I ran the very system he tried to weaponize. And I wasn't done." The day I walked up Glen's driveway in my crisp USPS polo, clipboard in hand, was the day the neighborhood finally saw the tables turn. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. He was outside already, in his usual Saturday morning routine, watering the same patch of lawn for the 3rd time that week, pretending not to watch every car and person that passed. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. For a moment, he didn't recognize me. Then he did. He froze mid-spray. Hose still running. Mouth slightly open like a fish that had just spotted the hook. "Morning," I said, casually flipping through the papers on my clipboard. "I'm here on official business." Glen blinked. "Official, what?" I held up the badge clipped to my collar. "Acting Postmaster. Willow Creek District. As of last week." He didn't respond. just stood there, his hose slowly soaking one of his over-manicured shrubs. "I'm here about a violation," I continued, "all business. Specifically, obstruction of mail delivery under Title 18, Section 1705 of the U.S. Code. It's a federal offense to block access to a mailbox. We documented the obstruction you installed in front of my property, and I've submitted a formal report. The items have already been removed in compliance with postal law." Glenn's mouth opened and closed again. The hose slipped from his hand and started flooding the driveway. You can't just take people's property," he sputtered. I raised an eyebrow. "Technically, we didn't. The rocks were placed in a public right-of-way that obstructed a federal mail route. Under the law, anything blocking that route can be removed without further notice. But don't worry, your decorative boulders are safe and sound at the city storage yard. You can pick them up next week." The look on his face? I'll never forget it. Somewhere between disbelief, rage, and the dawning horror of realizing he'd picked a fight with the one person who could actually outregulate him. He turned red. Then pale. Then red again. Like a malfunctioning traffic light. "This is harassment," he said through gritted teeth. "You're just trying to get back at me." I gave him a polite, almost sympathetic smile. "No sir, this is enforcement of federal guidelines. Personal feelings don't enter into it." He took a step forward. "I'm filing a complaint. You can't just show up at people's houses with a badge and a grudge." "You're welcome to file any complaint you want," I said, flipping to the final page on my clipboard. "But it'll end up on my desk, and I'll be the one processing it." He stared at me, utterly dumbfounded. That moment of pure powerlessness, that's what he'd been dishing out to the rest of us for months. And now, he finally had to taste it. But I didn't stop there. That week, I launched a full review of every mailbox in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about revenge, I was going to do the job right. I walked every block with my team, checking that every residence had legally compliant, easily accessible mailboxes. I took notes. I talked to homeowners. I explained the rules calmly and clearly, and unlike Glenn, I actually listened when they asked questions. Word spread fast. Neighbors started coming out to thank me. Tina from 2 streets over brought me lemonade. The Johnsons, who'd been fined for having a blue mailbox instead of Glenn's preferred taupe, shook my hand and laughed when I told them the USPS had no such color restrictions. Even Mrs. Carmichael, who hadn't spoken to anyone in 5 years, gave me a nod and said, "It's about time someone put him in his place." Within 2 weeks, the entire tone of the neighborhood shifted. People began decorating their mailboxes again, flower boxes, little flags, even one with a hand-painted mural of the town square. All the things Glenn had shut down in the name of uniformity came blooming back like spring after a long winter. But Glenn? Glenn doubled down. He tried filing a cease and desist letter claiming I was abusing my authority. I received the letter in the mail, an ironic choice, and filed it in the circular bin under my desk. Then he tried attending a city council meeting to complain. Problem was, the city had already received my report, reviewed the legal codes, and sided with the Postal Service. His complaints were noted, nodded at politely, and swiftly ignored. By the end of the month, Glenn's influence had shrunk to almost nothing. His reputation as a tyrant was now common knowledge. The neighborhood had seen the man behind the curtain, and he wasn't scary anymore. He was petty, and powerless. And then came the HOA elections. Every year, they held a vote for new board members. Normally, it was a quiet, under-the-radar thing. Maybe a dozen people showed up. But this year? Oh, people showed up. Lawn chairs lined the park. Parents brought kids. Seniors brought coffee and folding tables. There were flyers, posters, even a HOA Freedom bake sale. Glenn tried to run again, of course. But this time, people weren't buying it. He gave a little speech about standards and protecting property values, but it fell flat. No one clapped. Then Mrs. Kim, from the corner lot, stood up and said, "Standards are fine. Tyranny isn't." Another neighbor nominated me for community liaison, a new position designed to communicate between the HOA and local government departments, including the Postal Service. I wasn't planning on accepting. But when I looked around and saw the crowd nodding, smiling, hopeful, I knew I couldn't say no. I took the mic and said, "Let's bring this place back to what it used to be, a neighborhood, not a checklist." The applause was loud. Louder than Glenn's exit. A week later, I saw him walking his dog again. He didn't look smug anymore. He didn't even look angry. He looked small. Defeated. He gave me a little wave. I nodded back. Nothing more. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had something better. Respect. I kept doing my job. Mail deliveries improved. People talked more. Kids started riding their bikes again. We even held a little block party where folks could decorate their mailboxes and vote for the most creative one. Glenn didn't come. But everyone else did. In the end, I didn't need to yell, or fight, or stoop to his level. I just needed a clipboard, a little patience, and the law on my side. Glenn tried to control the neighborhood. But I delivered something stronger: justice, one letter at a time. Becoming the postmaster changed everything, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. What started as a petty feud over a mailbox had become something bigger, something I never expected. I didn't set out to be some kind of local hero. I wasn't trying to lead a revolution. I just wanted to get my mail without being harassed by a guy who treated homeowners like tenants in his imaginary kingdom. But once I stepped into that role, once I saw how much damage Glenn had really done, not just to me, but to everyone, I couldn't walk away from it. At first, people were hesitant. Years of passive-aggressive fines and warnings had made them skittish. It was like living under a neighborhood dictatorship. If your grass grew an inch too tall, or your garbage can wasn't hidden exactly the right way, you got a citation. Not a friendly reminder, but a formal letter, sometimes with a picture of the violation attached. People stopped talking to each other out of fear they might be reported for something dumb like a wind chime that was too reflective. The community spirit had dried up, and Glenn had poured salt in the soil. But after the rocks were removed and Glenn's power started to crumble, things began to shift. It started small. A neighbor on the next block over painted her mailbox yellow. Bright yellow. Just because she liked the color. She was a retired kindergarten teacher named Marla, and she said it reminded her of sunflowers and smiling kids. Under Glenn's rule, that mailbox would have been banned before the paint was even dry. But now? Nobody said a word, except to compliment her. Then there was old Mr. Hensley, a veteran who'd been cited 4 times for having an American flag sticker on his mailbox. I walked up to his porch one morning, introduced myself, and handed him an official USPS brochure. Inside, it clearly stated that patriotic decorations, including small flags or emblems, were perfectly acceptable so long as they didn't obstruct access or visibility. He looked at the brochure, then at me, and said, "Well, hell. Took M long enough to send someone with a brain." Soon, I started getting calls. Not complaints, questions. Genuine, polite questions. "Hey, is it okay if I move my mailbox a little closer to the sidewalk? Can I build a flower box around it? Would it be all right to add a solar light?" And every time I could say, "Yes, absolutely," people sounded surprised. Relieved. They weren't used to hearing yes. Glenn had trained everyone to expect a fight, and when there wasn't one, it almost confused them. That's when I realized what he'd really taken from us, our ability to feel ownership over our own homes. He'd replaced neighborliness with surveillance, cooperation with intimidation. People were scared to express themselves on their own property. A mailbox is such a small thing, but it's also symbolic. It sits right at the edge of your space, the intersection between public and private, between community and solitude. When someone messes with your mailbox, they're not just messing with a metal box, they're telling you your voice doesn't matter. So, I kept going. I started hosting monthly postal pop-ins. That's what I called them, little outdoor meetings at the park where anyone could swing by, ask questions, and get help understanding postal regulations, delivery schedules, or even basic neighborly etiquette. I printed flyers, passed them out by hand, and made sure people knew this wasn't just about mail, it was about rebuilding something we'd lost. The first one drew 10 people. The second? Over 30. By the fourth, we had to set up folding chairs and bring in lemonade and snacks. People talked. They laughed. They shared stories about the crazy things Glenn had done, like the time he fined a guy for having too many Halloween decorations, or how he once wrote up a widow for having unregistered wind socks. But they didn't just come to vent. They came to connect. And slowly, that connection started spilling out into the streets. Lawns looked friendlier. Sidewalks were less tense. People began greeting each other again. It was subtle at first, waves, smiles, nods, but it was growing. As for Glenn, he wasn't taking it well. After losing the HOA election, he pretty much vanished. His pristine lawns started looking less pristine. His weekly power washing stopped. His once daily walks became weekly. I'd see him from time to time, lurking behind his blinds or peeking out when we held events. But he didn't come out. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just faded. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was just peace. And honestly, it felt better than any petty payback ever could. One day, I found a letter in my mailbox, not the usual kind. Handwritten. No stamp. Just tucked inside. It was from Glenn. It read, "I see what you've done. People seem happier." I guess I didn't realize how much I'd become the villain. I thought I was protecting something. But maybe I was just afraid of change. I won't bother you anymore. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I read it twice, folded it up, and put it in the drawer with my old HOA citations. I didn't reply. Didn't need to. Some messages don't require answers. A few months later, we held our first annual Mailbox Makeover Day. The whole block got involved. Kids painted little designs. Seniors planted flowers around posts. One family turned theirs into a tiny model of a red schoolhouse. We had a contest, of course. Marla's sunflower yellow mailbox took first place, hands down. The local newspaper showed up, did a story on it. The headline read, "Postmaster brings community together, one mailbox at a time." It was a little cheesy, but I smiled when I saw it. Because it was true. We'd stopped being just a collection of houses behind fences. We were a neighborhood again. And every morning, when I walked my own route, clipboard in hand, USPS patch on my shoulder, I didn't feel like the guy who used to get bullied by a tyrant with a grudge. I felt like someone who'd taken a bad situation and turned it into something better. I never planned to become a postmaster. But maybe the mail, like life, knows exactly where it needs to go. And in the end, they tried to block my mailbox. Now, I deliver the whole damn street.